My name is Savannah Reed, and even now, years later, I still shiver when I remember that day. I had always believed that marriage meant partnership, that your spouse would stand by you through joy and hardship. But I learned the harshest truth about my life when I was about to give birth to my first child. That morning started quietly. I was sitting in the car, my hospital bag beside me, contractions coming faster than I could count, heart pounding like it might burst from my chest. Each wave of pain was a reminder that soon my baby would be here in the world. I called my husband, Ethan, to tell him we were leaving for the hospital. His response stunned me. "Savannah, just hold on a little. I need to finish some things at home first," he said casually, almost as if I were overreacting. I stared at my phone in disbelief. Ethan had always been my rock, holding my hand through every little scare, calming me down with a look, a touch. But today he was gone. I thought maybe he just meant a few minutes, that he'd be there any second. But as we drove, the minutes turned into excruciating hours. The hospital loomed closer with every contraction, each one more painful than the last. I called him again, no answer. Panic began to gnaw at me. Then I received a text from my best friend, Mia, that froze my blood. "Savannah, Ethan left with his parents. They're on some trip. He won't be back for days." I couldn't believe it. My husband, my partner in life, had chosen a family vacation over being with me as I was bringing our child into the world. Alone, terrified, in pain, I sat in the car gripping the steering wheel, unable to process how someone could be so selfish. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Every contraction felt like my body was being torn apart, and I kept imagining Ethan laughing with his parents, sipping coffee, oblivious to the fact that his wife was struggling alone just miles away. I wanted to scream, to cry, to run after him, but my body wouldn't let me. By the time I reached the hospital, I was shaking so badly that the nurse who rushed to help me almost scolded me for driving myself in labor. I couldn't even form words. Tears streamed down my face, partly from the pain, partly from betrayal. They helped me inside into a wheelchair, and I finally felt a semblance of safety, but the hurt in my chest was unbearable. Hours passed, the labor was long, excruciating, and every time I asked the nurse if she could call Ethan, her sympathetic smile made me feel worse. She tried to comfort me. "He'll come when he comes, honey. You need to focus on you and the baby. Focus." Easy for her to say. Focus when the person who promised to be there for you, through sickness, health, joy, or pain, decides you're not worth a few hours of his time. I hated him in that moment with a fury I didn't even know I had. By late afternoon, my body was exhausted, trembling, screaming with pain, but the doctors said the baby was finally ready to come. And then, through the haze of contractions, sweat, and tears, I felt the first tiny tug of life entering the world. My daughter, they placed her in my arms, and for a fleeting moment, everything else vanished. Her eyes, barely open, looked up at me, and I felt a fierce, unbreakable love. But even holding her, a part of me seethed with anger. Ethan wasn't there. He missed the very first second of our child's life. He chose himself over us. As I held her, I made a decision. I wouldn't just endure this betrayal quietly. I wouldn't let Ethan's selfishness define my life or my daughter's future. Somewhere deep inside, I felt the spark of something dangerous, something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Revenge. It started small. I would show him that life doesn't pause for selfish people. That when you abandon the ones who love you most, there are consequences. I wasn't going to ruin him physically. No, I was going to dismantle the life he thought he could control, piece by piece, without him even realizing it. But first, I needed a plan. I couldn't act in haste. The birth had left me weak, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. I began keeping a mental record of everything. Every lie, every selfish moment. Every time he put his own desires above me. I would wait for the right moment, the perfect opportunity, and when it came, he would regret leaving me that day. The days after the birth were surreal. Ethan returned 2 days later, expecting a soft welcome. Expecting gratitude, expecting forgiveness. Instead, he found me calm, collected, and cold. I carried our daughter with a quiet intensity, smiling at him politely, but my eyes said it all. I hadn't forgotten. "I hadn't forgiven you. You missed it," he stammered. I had to. My parents, I noticed. I said softly, "But the baby doesn't care where you were. I cared enough to bring her into the world myself." He opened his mouth, but no words came. For once, Ethan Reed didn't know what to say, and in that silence I felt power. Not over him yet, but over myself, over my anger, and over the future I was about to shape. That night, while he slept, I sat by the crib and whispered promises to my daughter. "One day, Daddy will realize what he lost," I said, "but you and we're unstoppable." And so the first seed of my plan took root. I didn't just want revenge. I wanted to ensure he felt the absence he created, not just in that hospital room, but in every corner of his life. I was done being the forgiving wife. I was done being the ignored partner. Ethan had chosen himself. Now I would choose my daughter and myself, and I would do it in a way he could never ignore. The first weeks after the birth were a blur of feedings, sleepless nights, and a new kind of clarity. When the adrenaline from labor finally faded, what remained was a slow, cold light. Ethan had chosen his comfort over his family, and the truth of that decision sat in my chest like a stone I couldn't swallow. I loved my daughter with everything I had, but the love was sharpened now by an edge I didn't recognize. Something like resolve, like the patient hunger of a wolf. I started small, because small things are the scaffolding of bigger plans. I kept the texts Ethan sent on his parents' trip. Every casual message, every excuse, every call he dodged. I printed them, highlighted the dismissive lines with a black marker. I screenshot his social posts, the smiling photos with his parents at a lakeside, the sunset selfies, the caption about family time. I photographed the items he'd left behind, his worn baseball cap on the closet shelf, the travel mug he'd forgotten, anything that could anchor a story. Evidence, I told myself, is more convincing than rage. At night, while my daughter slept in a bassinet in the corner, and Ethan snored softly in the guest room we'd converted into his space, I cataloged everything. I made a folder on my laptop and labeled it for her. It was an ugly, tender thing. I wrote down moments of humiliation I'd swallowed over the years, how he minimized my career dreams, how he'd jokingly forgotten to call my mother on her birthday, how he'd once laughed at my panic attack during a storm and told me I was dramatic. I did not let the folder be a manifesto of hate. It was a ledger. The tone was clinical, because fury can be wasteful unless it's pointed. I began to change the shape of my days. I sought out meetings with a paralegal friend from college, a woman named Laura who now did family law intake. I wasn't naive. I knew custody, money, and legal standing could be brutal. I wasn't preparing to litigate immediately, but knowledge is armor. Over coffee at a diner shaped like a relic, Laura walked me through what mattered. Documentation of abandonment, proof of involvement, or lack of it. By Ethan, financial records and a record of his negligence. Hearing it laid out made the world feel less chaotic. There were steps, there was leverage. I also needed another kind of power. Ethan thrived on perception. He curated his life like a feed. Every post, every comment, a careful brushstroke of who he wanted the world to think he was. If he could build an image of loyalty and family while abandoning his wife in labor, then undoing that image would sting in the place where his ego lived. My first move into the public vestibule of his life was surgical and petty in equal measure. It started with small social moments, subtle omissions that would become loud over time. At a brunch with mutual friends, when he made the offhand joke about the stress of family vacations. And getting away from the drama, I listened and smiled. Later that day, I messaged 4 close mutual friends with a short, composed note. A timeline of what happened that day, a screenshot of his text telling me to wait, a single sentence I repeated like a prayer: he left me in labor. I expected sympathy, I did not expect the ripple. One friend texted back, I had no idea. Another, who worked in marketing and had an instinct for public perception, asked if she could help me manage the narrative because no one should be gaslit about something as huge as birth. She offered to quietly point out inconsistencies in his posts to other friends, to ask questions in group chats that made his absence noticeable. The aim was simple: let his silence echo. But private humiliation only goes so far with people who protect their own. I needed to move inside his family's orbit. His parents were pillars in suburban society. Neighbors with perfect lawns, PTA members who knew everyone's birthday. I mulled over possibilities and landed on something that felt like justice but stayed within lines. I wrote an email. It was short, precise, and polite. Dear Mr. and Mrs. Reed, I wanted to tell you directly about something that happened on date. When I began having contractions, I called Ethan, and he told me to wait because he was at home. Later, I learned he had left with you on a trip. I'm sharing this because I believe in transparency, and because I think you should know how your son chose to act when I needed him most. I considered not sending it. It would be easier to stew in private anger, but the thing about truth is that it multiplies. I attached a couple of screenshots. No theatrics, no pleas, just facts. I sent it at 9:12 p.m., the hour when their tea had probably cooled and the world felt small. The response was immediate and not what I expected. Ethan called me that night, voice sharp and urgent. "Savannah, what did you do? Why would you go behind our backs?" he said. His panic was not for me, it was for himself. He sounded like a man who'd been told his favorite jacket had a rip. I told them what happened. I said, slow and cool, "They deserve to know. You can't do this. They love me. They'll call you dramatic. You'll ruin everything for yourself and the baby." His pleading was quick, practiced, the kind of guilt he'd dangle when he wanted me to fold. "You could have been there." I said, "You weren't. We both know what happened." The next morning, the world hummed differently. Mrs. Reed texted me at 7:34 a.m. "Thank you for telling us, Savannah. We had no idea. We'll come and talk. We need to understand." The words were odd, contrite and curious. Their visit that weekend was awkward and soft, like a conversation performed for cameras that didn't exist. At dinner, Mrs. Reed's eyes were wet. Mr. Reed's plate trembled as he pushed peas around. They kept saying we didn't realize, as if lack of knowledge absolved a son's choice. I watched Ethan's jaw work, a boy trying to solve a math problem too big for him. It was a beginning. The seeds of discomfort were planted in his parents' house. I watched the way he walked for days afterward, too careful, as if the ground might crack under him. He tried to be charming at the baby shower friends insisted on throwing to celebrate the family. And I smiled like a queen whose crown fit too well. When a cousin asked about his parents' trip and he fumbled for an answer, people who had already seen my quiet message exchanged small glances. Social capital, once chipped at, reveals cracks. At home, I changed other things. I opened a savings account in my name only, stashed away every extra dollar, as if it were a seed for a future I controlled. I started freelancing again. Remote consulting work I'd shelved for motherhood. At night, in the low light while the baby dozed, I learned how to format invoices, how to pitch clients, and how to build a buffer that made fear less loud. Independence is an underrated form of revenge. It detaches the tether someone used to hold sway. Watching my bank balance grow, even by hundreds, was a quiet victory. There were slights, a shirt missing, a comment in front of my mother that suggested I was too sensitive, and there were larger reveals. One afternoon, while sorting through old emails for tax info, I found a flight receipt for the trip Ethan took with his parents. The receipt showed he'd booked the flight at 10:04 a.m. on the morning I went into labor. He'd lied about finishing some things at home. I printed the confirmation and tucked it into the folder labeled for her. It thudded on the kitchen table like a verdict, then came a misstep on his part, the kind of human error that revenge often relies on, complacency. He began to assume I had softened. His texts returned to the casual tone he favored before the birth. One night, drunk on the false courage that comes from thinking a wound has healed, he posted an old photo of us on his feed. The two of us smiling on a honeymoon trip, and put a caption about family first. My throat tightened. I opened my phone, and with a steadiness that surprised me, replied to the post in the comments. "Funny how family means different things to different people. I gave birth alone while you were away." It was blunt. It was public. I felt the collective breath of our circle hitched. People responded. Some wrote, "Savannah, that's awful." Others, "Ethan, care to explain." The comment thread bloomed into a tiny public reckoning. Ethan deleted my comment as quickly as he could and messaged me. That was a low blow. He was right. It was low. It was also effective. What I did not do was take him to task with violence, blackmail, or schemes that would make me into something I would not recognize in the mirror. My plan was to expose him, to make the cost of his choice social and emotional, and to build a life that would make his absence obvious in ways that mattered. I wanted him to feel what abandonment had done to our child's early memories, tiny, invisible scars that accumulate into something visible. The middle months were a series of tests. When his father asked to babysit once so we could run errands, I agreed. 2 hours later, Ethan called asking where I had gone and accusing me of trying to trap his parents into picking sides. When I told Mr. Reed politely that we'd be fine and that his son was welcome to come over to visit the baby, he looked at Ethan like he was a stranger. The look was not harsh, it was disappointed, which hurt more. Disappointment travels further than anger. Word spread, as words do in a town where everyone knows at least one person who knows someone else. A coworker at Ethan's office, someone I had once made dinner with, texted me asking if I was okay and then hesitantly told me that Ethan had been quieter at the office, distracted, failing to show up for his usual Monday meeting. His boss noticed, she wrote, "I held that message like a trophy. It was not about causing his career to crumble. It was about balancing the ledger. He had chosen time with his parents over his child. Now his absence would be visible in the places that mattered to him. But as the public pressure mounted, something else began to shift inside me. Revenge felt different than I expected. It wasn't raw hatred all the time. It became an intelligence game, anticipating, acting, withdrawing, watching consequences unfold. Sometimes I found myself admiring the choreography of a plan that worked. Other nights I ached, not for what he'd taken, but for the person I might become if I let this consume me. I asked myself repeatedly, what is the end game? Was it to humiliate him publicly until he begged for forgiveness? Was it to teach him a lesson? Or was it about building a life so beautiful he could never touch it? The answer evolved. It wasn't merely to hurt him, it was to take back the narrative of my life. I wanted to show my daughter that when someone chooses abandonment, you do not disintegrate. You rearrange. You create a world where love is not dependent on the whims of a single person. I wanted to be the proof of that lesson. The plan's next phase was riskier. I needed a decisive moment, something that would force a confrontation on my terms. I orchestrated it quietly. I invited a few friends, a couple of neighbors, and the mothers from my prenatal class to an intimate meet the baby barbecue at the house. I knew Ethan would come if only to preserve face. I texted him casually, "Little get-together Sunday, hope you can make it." His reply came with an ellipsis and a shrug emoji. "I'll swing by." He wrote, "On the day, the yard smelled like charcoal and lemon." My friends brought casseroles and stories, and there was a softness in the air that comes from warm food and familiar voices. Ethan arrived later than anyone else, pale and stiff, as if he were a guest at his own life. He made the rounds, joked a little too loudly, and when he finally paused near the porch where I sat with the baby in my arms, he tried to drape an arm over my shoulders the way he used to. I felt the movement and led him, like a practiced actor accepting a pat on the back before the curtain falls. After dessert, as twilight made the string lights glow like small moons, I stood and asked everyone to listen. My voice did not tremble. I told a short version of what had happened, factual, unemotional, the kind of speech given by someone who had honed the art of stating the truth without pleading. I said, I want everyone here to know what happened, because narratives shape choices. I looked at Ethan as I said it, and he met my gaze but said nothing. He left soon after, angry and embarrassed and sputtering things about privacy and respect, but the important thing was not his exit. It was the way people looked at him on the way out, sympathetic toward the mother who'd been abandoned, puzzled at the man who'd left his wife in labor. That evening, a neighbor asked me if I was okay. A woman from our prenatal class hugged me like we were sisters. The ledger in my folder grew weightier with witnesses. In the days that followed, Ethan tried to reclaim his position. He wrote messages that alternated between apologetic and enraged. He wanted to salvage what he could. I let him talk at length. Listening is an underrated power. He confessed once in a voice soaked with something like shame that he'd been scared. I panicked, he said. They needed me, I thought. His words fell apart. His parents, he said, had guilted him into coming along, and he'd convinced himself that because his mother was emotional, it absolved him. It sounded like a rationalization. It sounded like a child in an adult's body. You could have called me, I said. You could have told me you were going. Anything would have been better than silence. He stared at me. For a moment there was a tenderness that might have been real. But tenderness can be an entryway for the same old patterns. And I did not want to risk my daughter's future on a man who returned home only when he felt comfortable blocking out the people who needed him. So I continued to build. I took on clients. I logged more hours in my new account. I spent lazy afternoons reading to the baby on the porch, letting the sun carve maps on my knees. I smiled at Ethan sometimes, a smile that said nothing and therefore everything. I attended PTA meetings and joined a local mother's support group where the women were honest and fierce in mine. With each small choice, my life became a mosaic that did not require his reflected light. The last act of part 2 was not spectacular by most standards, but it was decisive. One morning, as sunlight poured through the kitchen window and the baby cooed in the next room, I opened the folder labeled for her and added one more thing, a single page titled Next Steps. It wasn't a plan for retribution in the sense of cruelty. It was a plan for my life, custody agreements to explore if necessary, meetings with a financial advisor, a timeline for launching a small online business I'd named after my daughter, and a letter to Ethan that I would send when the time was right. The letter would not plead or threaten. It would be a statement of decision. It would say simply, I will not be your second choice, and then in the margin, the words that had become a mantra over the past months, choose. Because choosing is a power and I intended to use it, Ethan's face was a new kind of map now, lines of confusion and dawning comprehension. He could sense the change like the hush before a storm. The storm was not my aim. My aim was the quiet aftermath when the dust settled and we both saw what remained. I would not be a casualty of his choices. I would be the architect of a life that honored the child he'd helped create and the woman he'd underestimated. The months following my calculated moves had shifted the balance quietly but undeniably. Ethan was no longer the center of my world. My daughter, our home, and my ambitions were. The man who had left me in labor had begun to feel the weight of absence in ways that were impossible to ignore. The ledger I kept, the folder labeled for her, had grown fat with proof, witness accounts, timelines, and receipts, a record of truth and betrayal that I had never allowed to be clouded by emotion. It started with social consequences. A few well-placed messages to Ethan's friends, subtly highlighting the day he abandoned me, had rippled through our circle. People were no longer blind to his choices. His carefully curated social persona, the one where he was the loving husband, began to crack. Friends who had once smiled at his jokes now gave measured glances, and a few had quietly stepped back from his company. Pride, I realized, can be one of the most potent weapons when wielded correctly. I had also built my independence. My freelance work was thriving. The small online business I started, selling eco-friendly baby products, had grown beyond my expectations. I no longer needed Ethan's paycheck or approval, and that realization gave me a power that was intoxicating and stabilizing at the same time. Every time he tried to belittle me, I reminded myself silently, "You are no longer my anchor. I am mine." Then came the moment I had been waiting for, the confrontation that would finally draw the line. Ethan had begun to attempt reconciliation, sending long messages laden with guilt and excuses, trying to coerce forgiveness with words he didn't truly mean. I read each one calmly, savoring the irony. The man who had chosen himself over his family was now pleading to reclaim a life he had abandoned. I decided it was time to act. I invited him over for dinner under the pretense of talking things through, letting him believe he might regain his position. He arrived, nervous and hopeful, dressed too sharply, wearing a cologne that had always reminded me of our honeymoon. I let him in, smiled faintly, and gestured toward the dining table where the baby slept peacefully in her crib. "I've read your messages," I began, voice calm and deliberate, "and I think it's time you truly understand what happened, and what your choices cost." Ethan swallowed hard, eyes wide. "Savannah, you left me. You abandoned our child. You made a choice, and now you must face the consequences. Not in anger, not in violence, but in clarity," I said, pulling the folder from a side drawer and placing it on the table. The weight of it seemed to grow under his gaze. "This is everything. Every text, every post, every lie, every excuse, and it's not just for me, it's for her, so she can know that choices have consequences, and people who abandon her are accountable." He looked at the documents, flipping through them nervously. His eyes darted, sweat forming at the temples, and I saw something I hadn't seen before: genuine fear. Not fear for punishment, not fear for revenge, but fear for the image he had so carefully constructed, now crumbling. "You think this is fair?" he asked, voice trembling. "Fair?" I echoed softly. "I'm not here for fair. I'm here for truth, and I'm here for a life where my daughter and I are safe from your selfishness. This is not just revenge. It's justice in its purest form." I watched him as the realization sank in. The apologies, the excuses, the attempts to charm or guilt me, they all fell away under the weight of the folder. Ethan understood finally that leaving me in labor had been not a small misstep but a defining choice, one that could not simply be erased. In the days that followed, I implemented the last parts of my plan. I arranged legal consultations, not with anger but with precision, ensuring custody and financial independence were secure. I shared portions of the folder selectively with family members who mattered, ensuring the truth was known without public spectacle. My daughter's life would never be overshadowed by his absence again. Then came the moment that sealed everything. Ethan tried to regain intimacy, to negotiate forgiveness, to charm his way back into the life he had ignored. I stopped him, not with screaming, not with rage, but with calm words that cut deeper than any insult. "I cannot let you back into this world until you understand that love is action, not words. You will never abandon us again, or this is over." He realized too late that I wasn't bluffing. The woman he left behind had become unshakable, independent, and fierce. The girl who had sobbed alone in a car was gone. In her place stood a mother and a strategist, a woman who had transformed pain into power, heartbreak into structure, and betrayal into a roadmap for survival. The final act of revenge was subtle but complete. Ethan's social standing shifted, His parents saw the truth, and the mutual friends who mattered now understood his choices. I no longer needed to prove anything to him. The world had seen it already. The ledger was closed, but the lessons remained. I had chosen my daughter, my life, and myself over him. I had claimed back the narrative he tried to steal. Standing in the nursery one evening, watching my daughter sleep with soft breaths and tiny fists curling in dreams, I felt a profound sense of peace. This was the reward, the one no confrontation, no argument, no public humiliation could replace. A life reclaimed, a future secured, and a man who had learned, finally, that choices echo long after excuses fade. And in that moment, I whispered softly, as if she could understand, "We are unstoppable. And nothing, not even him, will ever take that away from us."